Good day, and welcome back to our Bible studies. Today we're going to start another book, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And before we get started, I thought it would be good to give some introduction as to the background to this book and as to who Mark really was. Mark was a Jew born from Jerusalem. He goes by the name Mark, which is a Roman name, and also by the name of John, which is his Jewish name. And sometime in the Bible, you see him addressed both ways, either as John or as Mark, and sometimes as John Mark. He apparently came from a wealthy family. His mother was named Mary, and she lived in Jerusalem. She had a fairly large home, so she probably had some wealth. And it was to this home that sometimes the disciples and the followers of Jesus would come. It's to this home that apparently Peter came after the angel released him from prison. He came to this home and was the one who knocked on the door and was let in. And it's also the home to where some of the followers of Christ came after his ascension. So it was not an unknown home. And it was not a small house because he obviously had a room large enough to accommodate a number of people. So this was this background, in a sense, of who Mark was. Mark wrote the gospel attributed to him. It is the shortest gospel in the Bible. It's also considered to be the first gospel that was written, even though it's second in placement in the biblical scriptures. It's known to be somewhat concise, with few extraneous words added. He gets right to the point, he sticks to the point, and then he goes to something else. So it's not really something which is very verbal in its extent, but very concise and relatively brief. It's been said that the first scene of Mark in the Bible may have been at the time of Christ's crucifixion and just before that in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the book of Mark, it talks about a young man who was there at the time of Christ's arrest and how he fled, leaving his cloak behind him. And this is a very brief section in Mark, but it's believed that this was actually Mark himself, and it was his experience at that time which led him to follow Christ later on in his life. He was involved in the ministry in many ways. He was also involved in the first missionary trip of Paul and Barnabas. Now Barnabas was apparently the sister of his mother Mary, which makes Barnabas a relative of Mark's. And it was Mark who accompanied Barnabas and Paul on their first missionary journey, as mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 13. But instead of continuing on this journey, he decided to return to Jerusalem. Whether it was because of fear or some kind of disagreement, or he just didn't want to go any further. Anyway, he returned to Jerusalem. Mark left Barnabas and Paul and returned to Jerusalem, as it mentioned in Acts 13, verse 13. And this created a rift between Paul and Barnabas. And therefore, Paul refused to take Mark on a subsequent journey, so Paul and Barnabas split up. Barnabas went with Mark to Cyprus, and Paul took Silas with him on his own journey. And this split apparently lasted for a number of years, some say up to 10 years. But there was a general reconciliation before it all ended. And Paul and Mark did reconcile. And it says in Timothy that Paul and Mark, they reconciled and labored together, both in Colossians 4 verse 10 and Timothy 4:11, and that it was said that Mark was very useful to Paul in ministry, as it said in 2 Timothy 4:1. So Paul and Mark reconciled and became friends and associates again later on. Now, if Mark was the one that was in the Garden of Gethsemane when Christ was arrested, he would have seen Peter, the actions of Peter and his sword against the Roman soldiers, against the soldiers there. And this may have had an effect on him because he followed Peter very closely and afterwards, and became somewhat of a intern to Peter. And Peter was referred to Mark also because of this, because of his closeness. Peter referred to Mark as his son in 1 Peter 5:13, verse 13. And it seems to be that much of Mark's gospel was actually given to him by Peter. It was dictated to him by Peter, or it was influenced by Peter. And it was said that you have two people here. You have Peter who was a denier of Christ, giving a gospel to Mark, who was a deserter on Christ's mission, on the mission for Christ, and with Barnabas. So you have a deserter of the mission getting information from a denier, Peter, and this is how the basis of the gospel came about. It shows that no matter what you do, God can still use you in the end. Actions sometimes can be overcome, can be forgiven, and can be superseded by subsequent actions, which really are the ones that count. The Gospel of Mark is primarily divided into two sections. One is, the first section is really showing Christ as a servant of the people. It says in Mark 10:45, "For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to be a ransom for many." And the first part of this gospel really shows Christ as a servant, in a serving attitude, in a serving position. And the second half of the gospel is really how he became a sacrifice for all of us. And these are really the two sections of this gospel, how it came about. So we have this young boy, Mark, probably in the Garden of Gethsemane, saw what happened, what Peter did, became a follower of Peter and of Christ, became a real mentor to him, and it was through Peter that much of the Gospel of Mark actually came about. Mark went on missionary journeys, or started off on missionary journeys with his uncle Barnabas, and with Paul. There was a big split at one stage, but they reconciled in the end, so that Peter called Mark his son in one of his epistles, and Paul also said that Mark was very useful to him in ministry. So there is also in Revelation there is a scene around the throne with the four beasts. The four beasts were considered to be emblematic of the four apostles or the four gospels, and the ox that's there in the vision in Revelation is believed to refer to Mark, because an ox is a serving creature, and Mark showed Christ as a serving Savior. So these are the basis of how this gospel seemed to come about, and the basis for its development. It's a very concise, a very brief in many ways picture of what happens in what happened with Christ, how Christ came to serve and how Christ actually ended up serving us all. So this is the basis, the background for how this gospel came about. And next week we'll start with the first few verses in the first chapter of this book, the Gospel of Mark. I hope you'll join me for it. But that's all for today. Bye for now. Hope to see you next week.